Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is July 22nd, 2015, and my guest is Summer Brennan, author of The Oyster War, the true story of a small farm, big politics, and the future of wilderness in America. And that is our topic for today. Summer, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks so much.
Now, your book weaves together a lot of fascinating stories about the role of government, environmentalism, the idea of wilderness, community, where our food comes from, and so on. But at the heart of the book is a dispute over whether an oyster company was going to be allowed to operate in the middle of the Point Reyes National Seashore on the coast of California, north of San Francisco. So I want to start by talking about the place where that story takes place, the area known as Point Reyes and the National Seashore. Where is it, and what is your personal experience of the place?
Absolutely. Well, as you said, Point Reyes National Seashore is north of San Francisco on the coast there, and it's about 100 square miles of rolling hills and open pasture land and some forests and ridges and some really beautiful beaches. And I grew up out there. I was born in the Bay Area, and from about the age of 4, grew up in West Marin, which is the community of these small unincorporated towns out in that area. So I grew up right next to Point Reyes National Seashore and was outside in it a lot, camping and going to the beach and hanging out in nature a lot.
It's a really, it's an extraordinary, physically beautiful place.
Oh yes, it's gorgeous. There was just an article I saw recently that was the top 10 or top 20 most beautiful unknown places in California, and the top 2 were both in Point Reyes. So it's a beautiful place, natural beauty, but the communities near to it are really interesting and wonderful too. There's a number of little towns that have become more popular recently with tourists as well. The great food community and a great agricultural community too.
Now that we've talked about it on EconTalk, of course, it's going to be a lot more crowded and less unknown.
Sure. Well, I actually had to laugh. I don't remember where it was, but there was an article about how actually I think Bodega was the cool place, as if it was like Point Reyes had already become so cool that it was a bit passé. And so something's like really trendy when there's like the pushback a little bit. So,
sure.
But yes, this will definitely add.
Now, try to give for those who haven't been there, and for those who, seriously, if you haven't been there, it's a beautiful place. But I have to add, there are many beautiful places north of San Francisco and south of San Francisco along the coast that are similar in landscape and in breathtaking beauty. But this is a little less disturbed than some of those. It's a little different, and it's a little more disturbed in some ways with human contact. So try to give people a feel for what it looks like and what it's not just a seashore. There's stuff going on nearby and on the up to the coast. There's this unusual mix of human activity. Absolutely.
Well, what makes it so fascinating, I think, is it does have that mix of proximity and remoteness. It's about an hour's drive from San Francisco with decent traffic, so it's very accessible, but it does feel very remote, and it gets millions of visitors a year, but it rarely feels crowded. I won't say never, but I've never got that sense. Maybe, right near the parking lot on one of the beaches at a, high day during the summer. But historically, it's been a working landscape for a long time. So there's a very interesting mix of uses. So about a third of the park is taken up with working farmland, or I should say pasture land. It's called the pastoral zone. And there are working dairy farms and cattle ranches there. There's also a Coast Guard station.
Picturesque lighthouse.
Yes, of course, picturesque lighthouse. And it was, so there's decades of, over 100 years of history in that regard too.
So in some sense, it's with the ranches and dairy farming that goes on there, it's an unusual place because part of it is very wild and part of it is less so. Yes,
and it happens very quickly too. I think is what's interesting about the landscape is you have a lot of different types of landscapes within a relatively small area in terms of these rocky cliffs and beautiful moors that look like something out of Wuthering Heights or something like that, and then you have these very dense forests. So it does change a lot, and that there's that mix of agriculture and wilderness, literally right next to each other.
Now, one of the great things about your book is you learn a lot about oysters and oyster farming, which I had no concept of. Most people know what an oyster is. I learned that an oyster has no brain, but does have a heart.
That's right.
And I learned how they are farmed, which is seemingly impossible. So try to give us an idea of the history of oyster farming, which is not something most people have much knowledge of. It's called mariculture, if I have that correct.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, mare from the word for sea. So for a while in the U.S., oysters were more of a harvested food than a farmed food. Some of the earliest European settlers, the Dutch coming here found billions of oysters ringing all the islands in New York Harbor, and so they were very plentiful. And for a long time, as I said, it was mostly a harvest operation. But oyster mariculture was born when people realized that, okay, if you took young oysters from this place and moved them to somewhere else with slightly different water quality, they would do better, or they would grow faster. Or maybe one place was very beneficial for oyster spawning, breeding and hatching, but they were more flavorful somewhere else. And so they would have that combination of the oystering, or maybe it's not as drastic as moving their whole location, but just moving the oysters around a little bit within a smaller area, or starting them out as little oysters in bags, but then leaving them in a more open area for them to mature. And so there's a lot of different techniques. And what I found fascinating talking to different oyster farms and different oyster farmers, even within the same bay, is that they all had their different special techniques, which was very interesting.
Well, the part that was extraordinary to me is that there aren't any oysters particularly native to the San Francisco Bay Area, and the early and the early days of oyster eating in the aftermath of the gold rush came from people shipping oysters in barrels across the country and growing them. So talk about how they did that. Well, that's crazy. It's bizarre. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. That was fascinating to me, and it went against everything that I had heard about oyster history in the Bay Area. And I had no idea I was going to encounter that, but I, marched over to the UC Berkeley Bancroft Library to do my 19th century oyster research, and I found all these accounts of this man named John Stillwell Morgan, who was the oyster pioneer, really, at the West Coast. And he came out from New York. He was from Staten Island. And he was sent out by one of New York's biggest oyster barons with gear and funding to go in 1849 with the first rush of 49ers with the gold rush to look for oysters. And he didn't find any. And that's what surprised me is I'd always heard that there were plentiful native oysters in the San Francisco Bay. But he looked everywhere. He didn't see them. And so he spent about 20 years working on shipping them down from Washington Territory, because a couple years into his search in San Francisco Bay Area, he found out that they were up there in a place that used to be called Shoalwater Bay and is Walapa Bay now. And so he spent about 2 decades trying to get the Washington oysters to establish in the bay, and some crops would work, but but not a lot. They were very small, and it was just a lot of hard work. And then in 1869, with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, they started shipping out oysters from New York and New Jersey in barrels. And that's when his empire just kind of, really took off.
And he realized, this is the part that's so, it's a combination of brilliant and shocking. He realized he could ship a lot more by bringing them as babies, infant oysters, whatever you want to call them, oysterettes.
Yeah.
And then maturing them in the water of around San Francisco, right?
Right. And the interesting thing about the oysters, as I mentioned, with the development of oyster mariculture, is that where the oysters grow up matters a lot for how they, everything, their texture and their taste. So he first was shipping them out as grown oysters, as it was normally done. And then he realized it was just too expensive with the freight. So he shipped them out a bit smaller. And then he thought, well, I don't remember what the percentage is off the top of my head right now, but, it's okay. So 70% survived. That's not bad. Let's see if we can get them out even younger. And the freight was the same for the barrel. So I think instead of being able to get like 600 oysters per barrel, he would get 20,000 or something. And it was fascinating to me to read about it because he was interviewed by Bancroft, about being this titan of industry. And it was a very big deal, kind of industry secret, the fact that he did this. And there was always, notes in the archives about how they couldn't publish that detail. And so there's this interview, the result of this interview ended up in a book about prominent businessmen in San Francisco at that time. And that's not in the book.
And once he got the babies out, the little oysters out here, what did he do? How do you and talk about how a modern oyster farm in the Bay Area, what are they doing?
Sure, absolutely. Well, it's not that different in a way. So you get the little baby oysters, and they can be called sets, and so there'll be a bunch of little tiny baby oysters will adhere to an adult oyster shell, or sometimes the shell of another shellfish, and then you put them in the water and wait for them to grow. And different species of oysters grow different rates. As I wrote about in the book, I went out and toured some of the beds at Drake's Bay Oyster Farm, and those oysters took about 18 months to 2 years, depending, maybe less, to mature to full size that they would sell.
But in modern times, they're not shipping them on rail cars across from New York.
No. So
where are they getting the little ones from?
Sure. Well, the different oyster farms do different things. So the majority of the oysters grown in California are the Pacific oyster, which is native to Japan. And so in the early days, those were coming in shipments from Japan. But now they breed them. Some farms in California breed them. They have them in Oregon. So if they try to breed, or spawn their own new oysters, but it doesn't work out, or there's an issue with the water and they all die, they can order them from another farm and they'll get a shipment. I don't think they come in big wooden barrels anymore, but similar to Morgan's day, they'll get the baby oysters from somewhere else or spawn their own. And
this is a stupid question, but you don't have to feed them.
No, well, that's the thing. You have to give them. Well, you have to put them in water that has their food already in it, which is algae. So you just make sure that the water is the kind that they will like, that has enough algae for them to fatten up, but not too much that they choke.
And the last, I think, fact to get straight before we move into some of the controversy is that. When we talk about the Drake's Bay Oyster Company, which is where the dispute is the company that gets involved in the dispute, which is located in the Point Reyes National Seashore, there's no – this is just so bizarre. There's no place for them to adhere to. There's no rocky bottom or – So they're suspended on strings. Is that correct? Do I have that right?
Yeah. Yes. And
how do they do that?
So the oysters, they don't have a foot who has a foot, like a mussel has like mussels have I can't remember the name of the anatomy. A thingy, exactly. But oyster shells will adhere pretty solidly to something hard, and that's how they stay. And then over time, oyster reefs build up where the old deceased oysters kind of become part of the hard substrate that the new oysters can adhere to. So baby oysters will, when they're first born, they're mobile and they kind of swim around the water, and then their exterior will start to calcify. And so once that happens, they will kind of settle to the bottom or settle onto some hard surface and attach and grow there. And they will stay growing there unless you take them off and move them. At some oyster farms, they start with a little swimming larva, and they'll have them attached to either pieces of shell or other oysters, or I've seen them do it with rods, like a long plastic or metal rod, and the baby oysters will all adhere to that and start to grow. And then when they get a bit bigger, they chip them off without harming them, and then they can move them somewhere else. And so they can put them in a bag for them so that they're more mobile in the water, so they can put them in one part of the bay and they can grow for a while there, and then they can move them to somewhere else.
And I think
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think the last piece to understand is that the action in this story takes place in what's called Drake's, I don't know how to pronounce it. Is it estero or estero?
Join the club. I always say estero, but I've heard both.
So I'm going to follow you. So in Drake's Estero is an estuary, an inlet from inside Drake's Bay. Drake's Bay is a massive sheltered bay, almost like an inverted Cape Cod. You can find that on a map, folks.
Sure.
And then up inside, up the estuary is where the oysters are growing, because that way you don't have storms and things that are going to take all your stock and send it everywhere. You can find them in the morning when you need them, when you need to pick them, right?
Yes, and I guess for people to visualize, Drake's Estero. Goodness, see, I can't even.
No, it's tricky.
The estuary, it's sort of shaped like a wonky, wrinkly glove, a little bit, in the sense that it's got 5 main sort of fingers that kind of reach out into the land. I heard somebody say it looked to them like a chicken foot, but I'm going to go with glove. So that's sort of the shape of it, and it is sheltered. And oysters are often grown in estuaries or in bays near where a river feeds in. They like brackish water, and when there's a little bit of fresh water getting into the oysters, sometimes they'll have a sweeter taste, which a lot of people like. So that's the best environment for oyster growing.
So now let's move to the controversy. And okay. On the surface, this is a very small story. It's about 31 workers many of them living in not fancy shacks or cabins or
very modest.
Near the water, growing these oysters, harvesting these oysters. It's a very small operation. It's hard to imagine that this is going to become a national story that's going to get people really riled up. But it does, and that's a good chunk of the book. So try to give us a thumbnail of what the fight was about and what happened. It's a thumbnail, because obviously we could spend the rest of the time just on this, but give us just the overview.
Well, the succinct overview is that there was this oyster farm in the estuary, on and off since the 30s with different ownership, but one ownership from the 50s until 2004. And then a cattle rancher from next door bought the oyster farm, and the National Park Service said that the lease would be terminating in 2012, and the new owners did not want the lease to terminate. And so there was a big battle over that, and if they could extend it, and why they would or why they wouldn't, and whether the farm was harming the estuary or not, or benefiting the estuary or not. And since the reasoning for evicting the oyster farm was that the area wasn't just in a national park, but a wilderness area, there was a question of what is wilderness and what belongs in wilderness and what does that really mean?
Yeah, I want to talk about that. But one I think
Sure.
one detail we got to mention is that between the establishment of this farm in the 30s, 1962 is the time when the Point Reyes National Seashore Act gets in place. And
Yeah.
I'm going to read the line that you quoted there. It says, the government may not acquire land in the pastoral zone, which you mentioned before, where the dairy farmers are and the ranchers. The government may not acquire land in the pastoral zone without the consent of the owner, so long as it remains in its natural state or is used exclusively for ranching and dairying purposes. And, of course, that description grandfathered in essentially the farmers in the area if they were farming cows.
Right,
But it
right.
left unspecified oysters, except that at some point it said that oyster – when do we get the key statement that the lease expires in 2012, the opportunity to use that land for oystering?
Absolutely. Well, and the passage that you're referring to was talking about a time when they were discussing property condemnation. And so the landowners, the different ranching families, who I, as you know, write about in the book, there was a question of whether they were just going to be informed, hey, here's some money, you have to move, based on government appraisals.
The equivalent of eminent domain.
Exactly. And so it was decided that they couldn't do that, that the ranchers had to consent. And they did. So the ranchers decided that they would sell their land to the government, and that was all getting worked out in the 60s, and then in the park's created in 62, and the oyster farm that was in existence was called the Johnson Oyster Company, and he only had a few acres. So these ranching guys had hundreds of acres and lots of land, really valuable land. And Charlie Johnson just had a few next to the estuary because he didn't own the estuary. He just had, leases to farm oysters there. So he sold in 1972. And at that time, he signed a lease, which had a paragraph that said, where's the language? I'm sure I have it here somewhere, but
it's all right.
It's okay. But basically, that it may be renewed, and that was a 40-year lease, so 2012. So it could be renewed, depending park policies in place at the time, basically, and that it was a terminable lease, but that they couldn't terminate it without compensating them, basically. So that happened in 1972, and then, but 4 years later, the Point Reyes Wilderness Act happened, and that designated 33,000 acres of the park to be a wilderness area, which has different restrictions than just a national park. So that's sort of where the tricky part came in for a lot of people, is whereas it's relatively common to have commerce and private business and agriculture in a park, a wilderness area is sort of a different story. And a lot of people had very different opinions about how that should get worked out.
But in many ways, that's a legal question about what the rules of the game are once the government designates it as a reasonable people can argue about whether this plot of land or that plot of land should be wilderness or not, run by the government or not, et cetera. But
Right.
I think what's fascinating to me about this case, and you reflect on it often as you write about it, and you write about it very eloquently. What's fascinating about the case is that on the surface, I mean, that's a reasonable argument. Should we have wilderness areas? Who should administer them? What should be the rules within them? Those are interesting policy questions. People disagree about them, but that's fine. That isn't what this turned out to be about in the public sphere. In the public sphere, the way I read your book, and I want to get your reaction to this, in the public sphere, the debate was about whether this was fair. Because poor Mr. So you said it in 1972, Mr. Johnson signs a deal with the federal government that says he has use of the land for 40 years to farm oysters, and after that, the lease runs out. It may not or may be renewed. In the meanwhile, it gets declared a wilderness, which means it's probably not going to be renewed. And he runs out of money or doesn't want to do this anymore. And in 2004, he sells it to another key player, which is Kevin – how do you pronounce his name?
Lunny.
Lunny. So the Lunnies own this farm. They rename it the Drake Bay Oyster Company. And that's Sir Francis Drake, by the way, is who that area is named after because it's a beautiful story. You talk about it. It's really nice about the Golden Hind being anchored offshore. I really like that.
Yeah.
So Kevin Lunny buys this property with the knowledge that he really only has a guarantee of 8 years.
Right.
And I guess what the dispute is about, and I think people who might disagree with your book, you claim otherwise, but the dispute is about, is that the case? Is it –
right.
In other words, if I say to you, you're buying this for me, and I've got to tell you, you've only got it for 8 years. Okay, well, that's life. Maybe it'll be renewed. Maybe it won't be. But you suggest that time and time again when Lunny tried to see if it could be renewed, the government said no. You could disagree with that or not. You could argue it should have been renewed. You could argue that it shouldn't be wilderness. But there's no deception. And I think when this reached a level of controversy, what happened is that people felt that Lunny had been treated unfairly. And yet I would say your bottom line is, no, he just didn't get what he wanted.
It's so hard because, I was just looking at some photographs of the oyster farm the other day, and it was such an emotional issue. And I really feel for everybody that was involved. I know that they cared so much about the farm and all the workers who, while Drake's Bay Oyster Company only existed starting in 2005, many people had worked there for decades. I feel like it almost sounds callous to say, well, they just didn't get what they wanted. I think it's just that their vision of what was possible wasn't really in line with what they were being told.
And they didn't want to hear it.
Yeah.
And then I guess...
Right. That was one of the biggest shocks for me, actually, in my research, because I had the impression that there was something more solid there in terms of what they had to work with, that there had been some promise of renewal or suggestion of renewal or something. And I really tried to find it. I really did. And I just couldn't find anything. And I appealed to Drake's Bay. I appealed to their legal team, and pretty much anyone I could think of. But I couldn't find anything.
So that's the negative on the Lunny side. The negative on the government side, again, as the reader of your book, is the following. At various times in this debate over whether maybe the government should give them a lease extending past 2012, it appears that government science was either in error or strategically manipulated to make the case that oysters weren't good for the bay. Oysters weren't good for the environment. Oysters were damaging the wilderness. And I think it's a sobering account, no matter which side of the political debate you're on, whether you're worried about the encroachment of humanity into wilderness areas or vice versa. You're worried that government's too restrictive about the uses of private property in various settings. Neither side comes across so attractively in the book, to be honest. Is that a fair reading?
I think so. That was my impression, that I feel that I understood, or I tried very hard to understand the motives of everyone involved and to sort of, try to put myself in somebody else's shoes and think, okay, to be empathetic. But yeah, I would agree with that characterization that nobody came out of this, without any mud on their shoes, I guess, is a way to put it.
Very appropriate for an oyster story.
Right, exactly.
So I'm going to read a quote from the book, which I think is very adds another dimension that we haven't talked about yet. You can elaborate on it. Here's the quote. The oyster feud was a strange political dispute in that both sides seemed to be liberal Democrats who supported organic, sustainable farming on the one side and liberal Democrats who supported wilderness on the other. Many said that they supported both, but had to come down on a particular side for one reason or another. And of course, that's the end of the quote. But of course, there were there's side issues about, how much wilderness there should be and what should be the human footprint, et cetera, et cetera. But what's one of the fascinating aspects of the story is that it was a dispute between the romance of local food, which these oysters were providing to local restaurants, versus people who wanted to hike in a pristine place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or kayak, I guess, because it is water. So, but yes, no, that's true, and I think that's maybe part of why it got a lot of attention. I think there's a number of reasons why it got that kind of attention, but I think that was one is people were confused by somebody that would normally look at a dispute and say, oh, okay, so the Sierra Club is on this side of the dispute, and I like the Sierra Club, so I'm going to be on that side too. But then they'd look and they'd see that Michael Pollan, the food writer, was on the other side, and that would be confusing. It's like, wait a minute, these are all people, whose values align with mine. So what is it about this case that's splitting it? And so I think that was something that was unusual for a lot of people in the Bay Area anyway, is that it was confusing in that sense. It wasn't easy for people to sort of figure out, who to support.
Who to root for. Very consistent with the economics central idea. One of the central ideas of economics, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And here was a case where the cost, somebody was going to pay a cost. It just was a question of who, and there's no easy answer, I think, for people who wanted to come down on the, quote, right side.
Right. And it wasn't entirely liberal Democrats, too. I mean, I believe the Drake's Bay Oyster Company owners identify as Republican, and there were others. So, I don't want to oversimplify it in that it was only Democrats involved.
No, I know it, but we know what you meant.
But exactly, but yes, that was an unusual, or I don't know if it's really that unusual, but it's something that was of note to some reporters.
And I guess it gets very ugly in parts. Friendships get, I'm sure, ruined and ended over this dispute. I found it interesting that as far as I know, nobody gets killed. There's the only shooting takes place is with a camera, which is an embarrassing episode in the book that you recount of somebody trying to videotape surreptitious activity or inappropriate activity by the oyster boats and its effect on seals. That's an amusing comedy of errors, really. But this is the kind of dispute in a different part of the country. I think people would have been killed, but at least there are no deaths here.
Yeah, well, thank goodness. When I was, I shouldn't even say it. When I was thinking of writing this book and speaking to people about it and publishing, somebody said, well, no one's been killed yet, but there's still time. I was like, oh God, I know all these people. Don't say that. It's horrible. But no, I mean, I had reporters say to me that, before this had wrapped up, that they expected militia groups to show up and that guns would come out. And I think you're right. Had it been somewhere else, that may have happened. I think they were referencing the Bundy Ranch situation.
The Marin area is not known for its hunters, which the gun ownership in that area, part of the country, is relatively low compared to others.
It is. There's a real stigma to hunting for a large amount of population in the Bay Area, which I talk about a little bit in the book, as you
Yeah. So let's just finish the story, and then we'll talk a little bit about the consequences. So the end of the story is that 2012 comes along, the permit is not extended, and the Lunnies go to court. What happens then?
So they sue the federal government, in a nutshell, basically just accusing them of capricious action, and but they are denied, and they try to take it to the Supreme Court, and that is ultimately also not taken up. So they lose their battle, and there's a settlement about what they need to do to clean up, and come, I guess spoilers, but, at the end of 2014, they had to leave. And so they closed down the farm, and it's no more. And now the park is working to clean up the area where the farm was.
And some of the oysters were not harvested, I assume. They were.
Right. Yeah, they kept planting
about that
until late date. I don't know when the last planting was. I think it was out of a very it's really incredible optimism on the part of Drake's Bay to keep planting, and their conviction was really something to be admired in a lot of ways, because they just definitely felt like they were in the right and that they were going to keep fighting until they got what they wanted. But so the oysters were planted pretty late in the game, so there was a lot of oysters that went to waste, and a lot of oysters that were still in the estuary by the time the farm moved out. And there's probably still some out there, but they put out warnings that there shouldn't be consumed. I don't know. They may have gotten them all by now, but there was many still there.
Yeah. Did they have any predators, by the way? They must.
Oysters.
Yeah. Who eats oysters?
Besides
us.
Besides us, raccoons eat oysters. I think.
Otters?
Pardon?
Do otters eat oysters? I feel like they do.
Otters probably do. There aren't many sea otters around Drake's Bay, and I don't think there've been river otters in the estuary, although they are returning to the area, and some sea otters too. But stingrays actually tended to be the biggest predator, or the biggest problematic predator for oyster farmers in the Bay Area. Is stingrays would get to them, and then oyster drills, which aren't native to the area but were introduced with the shipments, in the 19th century.
Well, the idea of encountering a stingray up in one of the fingers of that glove is a pretty frightening thought. In that shallow water.
Yeah. There's fewer of them. I mean, there's great stories from some of the old timers in West Marin of they would set up fences to keep the stingrays out from around oysters and different shellfish that they were growing in the area.
Let's talk about wilderness. You have a lot of thoughtful things to say about it. One of the fascinating aspects, of course, is that as you put it at one point, it's a lovely idea that many people care about deeply, that the land should be returned to its wild state. But as you ask,
right.
Wild as of when?
Mm-hmm.
Because what is it? And talk about the Native American population and their role in that.
Sure. There was a number of different Native tribes living in the Bay Area prior to the arrival by Europeans. Someone has said that it's been said that actually it was one of the most populous areas in the Americas outside of the Aztec cities. I wasn't able to confirm that, but it's an interesting thought. And considering how temperate the area is, I wouldn't be surprised. So there was a number of tribes living there. And from everything that I've read and heard, they were very involved in managing the landscape and even managing animal populations to a degree. They hunted the tule elk, and they would burn areas of brush to increase pasture land for the elk, and the elk like to eat the fresh young plants that grow up after a controlled burn. So they had a very, intimate relationship with the land. So the native populations managed the land very closely, as I said, but there was a lot of changes that happened as soon as the Europeans arrived. As I write, many of the grasses that you see in California in general and in the Bay Area are not native grasses. Even these iconic grasses that you see that turn this golden color in the summer, they weren't there 300 years ago. This is Mediterranean grass that came with the Spanish cattle and later with other animals. So there's just been a lot of change. I mean, obviously there used to be bears and all kinds of different predators that have moved out. Tule elk were absent from the Point Reyes area for about 100 years before being reintroduced. So a lot has changed. So basically, when you're talking about a wild place or an original wild place, it's interesting because, an ecosystem is always in flux. And people talk about the balance of an ecosystem, but actually, all species, plants and animals are always vying for survival and ascendancy to a degree. And if anyone could become more productive and more successful, even to a detrimental degree, they would do so. There's not a lot of awareness on the part of a tule elk, that it's going to eat out all of its own habitat. There was recently a population crash in the elk out in Point Reyes, actually, probably because of the drought. But, so there's things change over time. So it is an interesting question of how far to an original wilderness can you get, and what does that even really mean, and does it matter, and what about wilderness matters? And I think that that's sort of a question that's in flux now of what is the core of wilderness, so that we can preserve it and figure out what belongs there and what doesn't.
What's interesting to me, and by the way, we did an episode on this issue of balance of nature with Daniel Botkin ages ago in EconTalk 2007, and we'll put a link up to it. But because I do think we have a certain false image of nature's equilibria, and it's good to keep the truth in mind, I think. But we have a romance about wildness and wilderness that is in some sense inherently impossible to implement. And as a person who loves that golden grass, and I've taken hundreds and hundreds of photographs of that landscape in different light in the Stinson Beach, Mount Tamalpais area, in Muir Beach, and all up and down the coast. I love that landscape. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. And now you've ruined it for me. You've told me it came with Spanish cows defecating seeds from
not native. But yeah,
and I guess
a lot of it.
So, so what I was going to say is that there's something actually very beautiful about that. That the human desire for exploration has made its mark on that landscape, and brought something wild from, or not so, whatever you want to call it, from the Mediterranean all the way thousands and thousands of miles. Maybe I'll appreciate it even more now. But it does make the point that attempts to recreate the Garden of Eden are in many ways a fool's game, and really a form to me of self-deception. We want our wilderness, and that could be a white person's explorer wilderness from 1500, or a Native American wilderness from a different time, and we should be honest and realistic about it.
Right. I think it's a question. I mean, I have very romantic sensibilities, which I'm sure is apparent in the book.
Yep, very enjoyable. Love that part.
But even so, I think when it comes to thinking about wilderness, I think I'm more of a realist, or a functionalist than a romantic, in that I think what matters, it matters less the technicality of native or non-native, or how long something has been there or not. And that's why I think I write this, that one of the central issues of this story across the board was one of belonging, of what belongs where and who and why and who decides. And that can be an oyster farm or a kind of grass. And sometimes something's just too late. And, the California grasslands have reached a new equilibrium. And, they have their own system going. So nobody's going to go and rip up all of the non-native oat grasses in California. I've never met anyone that wants to. So you kind of have to, sometimes when somebody says, well, just because something's non-native, we should take it out. There's foxgloves growing in Point Reyes National Seashore, which are not native. And I happen to like that flower a lot. Somebody might make an argument that because it's non-native, it doesn't belong there. But you could also say, well, it's not hurting anyone. And, it's growing right next to grass. It's also technically not native. And I live near there, and I'm not native to this part of the world. So, I mean, I am, but, not ethnically. So
yeah, you're an import.
Yeah.
I'm going to use an image I've used probably way too much in the last few episodes. I hope listeners aren't tired of it, but we talked going back a few episodes ago and have revisited this idea that it's hard to create a prairie. That you might know what is in a prairie, but you can't just take all the ingredients and plant them all and get a prairie. Certain things will dominate at the wrong pace and end up with something very different. And I think the implication of that example for this story is that if you eliminated the non-native grasses, you're not going to necessarily be able to recreate what California looked like 10,000 years ago, or even 500 years ago or 600 years ago when Drake showed up, because you don't have the right recipe. You don't know how to get there from here. And so inherently you have to be doing something that's partial, that's imperfect, that has to accept the fact that we can't go back to that Garden of Eden wherever you want to date it.
Sure. And sometimes, I mean, people do experiment with either rewilding or with native plant restoration that are successful. So it kind of depends on the instance and the scale too. And I think that there's sort of room for both. And I think what's interesting about, you know, when you have scientists working in a space, whether it's because it's a national park or what have you, you know, I think I mentioned in Point Reyes, there was all this European beach grass, continental beach grass growing, and there's an area that they pulled out large tracts of it. And a lot of local people kind of just rolled their eyes like, oh, why? Like, what's the point? It looks nice. You know, we're used to it. It's been there for over 100 years. Like, leave it be. But when I did go out and see the spot that they had done this restoration, and it was really interesting because all these new little plant ecosystems had grown back. So, you know, again, you're not going to go and re-landscape all of California, but it is interesting to see little bits. So, I mean, I could talk for hours about all this stuff. So I don't get me started on rewilding projects.
I'm going to mention one other thing though, because I think it's important, which is that the government responds to political pressure. It responds to the voices of voters, of lobbyists, of money, of all kinds of in all kinds of complicated ways. And so, even if you and I were very into rewilding and thought that the right way to keep the Thule elk population when it was too large, the right way to limit it is to reintroduce bears into the area. Right. The political forces are just not going to allow that. Just like in, you know, it took about 100, I think I got this right, maybe 100 years or so to reintroduce wolves back into Yellowstone. Because they had been removed really for political reasons because people were scared of them. They were not decimating, but they kept the elk population down, and people like looking at elk. It gives them a sense of wilderness that's safe. And so I've always hated that Yellowstone was something of an amusement park masquerading as a wilderness because of that. And I'm glad that the wolves are back, and maybe we should introduce bear back into Point Reyes, but it's unlikely to happen just for political reasons.
I think the ranchers would have a problem with that.
Yes, they would.
I mean, they have complaints with the elk. I think that grizzly bears would probably have a little buffet with the cows. But yes, but that's not the only reason. Yeah, that's the tricky thing, you know, when so much of the world is tamed, that the parts we preserved to be wild or quote unquote wild, it's not so easy you can't just say, okay, grizzly bears, stay over there and do your thing, and that's it. And that's like the nature of something being wild, is it doesn't work like that. So hence there's all kinds of fascinating conflicts that spring up.
And there's a population challenge. You can't have 3 of them. You probably need 30. And when you have 30, they're going to do things you don't like. And
but then you have prey animals, though, that have evolved to be very productive because they, you know, were everybody's food. So, I mean, there's been a lot of issues with the Thule elk and other types of, you know, large game in Point Reyes with overpopulation because there aren't predators, but there's no hunting. So it's, you know, what do you do?
And every once in a while we have a sanctioned hunt where a bunch of them get killed for just to try to limit those impacts, right?
Some places, yeah. In Point Reyes, that is still an unsolved question.
Well, what you're right about the deer in there, which is another ungulate of the region for a long time, is really very beautiful, and I encourage people to read the book for a lot of reasons, but one of them is to read about the white deer, and it's really special. I want to talk about the elusive nature of truth. You came into this, and I want to hear your perspective, and I'll give you mine as a reader of your book. So you came into this somewhat sympathetic to the Drake Bay Oyster Company, at least that's what you say.
Yeah.
And you spend way too many hours trying to figure out what really happened and who said what, and it's a detective novel in some dimension. And you come to a conclusion. And I suspect you come across as incredibly reasonable, as a truth seeker. It's inspiring in many ways. And yet I assume there are going to be a lot of people who are going to hate your book. and they're going to say, "Oh, she missed the story. She lied. She slanted it toward the Park Service, toward the whatever, the environmental story." What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly didn't lie. I mean, if I've put anything in there that doesn't turn out to be true, we'll just correct it. I have all my sources, and there is a bibliography at the end of the book. And I did my best to fact check, and someone else fact checked. So we did what we could. This story was huge, and there were so many wormholes to fall into. And, towards the end when I was writing this, I read this book by Eula Biss called On Immunity, which is another controversial topic about vaccination and different things. But at this one point, she writes about how in her research, she felt like Alice in Wonderland falling through this shaft of like books on all sides, more than she could ever read. And one person, she finds, different sources, and one, I think this is from Alice in Wonderland, so this is appropriate for a 10-year-old, but, one source says, drink me, and another says, eat me, and another says this. And, after a point, when there's so many different perspectives, and this is, I think what I say is that I had to say, okay, this is the best I could do for the time that I allotted to this story. And everything else I have to just kind of walk away. And I do feel confident that I got the core of the story right. I know people will disagree with me, especially about the science stuff. And there's parts that I could have added, 4 extra chapters on. And,
I think you made the right choice there.
Yeah. I mean, it's a book. I didn't want it to be too long. It's not an encyclopedia. And I think especially people that were insiders to this, will surely be outraged over one thing or another, just in the sense of, oh, but she didn't write about this part of the story, or she didn't write about this. And I do say that. I say that there's lots that I left out. There's things that I left out that would have made both sides look better and worse. But in the end, I think that I tried to be fair and representative, and, and it isn't a secret. In the end, I did not get a final interview with the Drake's Bay Oyster people that I wanted. They didn't respond to any of my requests at the end. And so that's, if anything's missing, I think it is that piece, because I would have liked to get a more individualized take. What I had to settle for was what they said on public record to, other media, and they were very vocal about it. So that's,
well, that's like,
yeah. It was such an,
I didn't mean to accuse you of dishonesty. I don't.
Oh no, it's okay. I know people say that.
They will. But what I meant was that this is such a complicated story, and do a beautiful job giving it a narrative arc. Right. And inevitably, as you say, you have to leave some things out that might have shaded one's feelings as a reader toward one side or the other. And yet, what you gave to me as a reader was that enough to make what appears to be a decision about the fairness of it. Again, whether it's good public policy or not, it's a whole separate question. That's not what the book's about. We all have preferences on that, and mine, by the way, are sympathetic to the idea. Although I wish there were private wilderness, and there is some. National parks are one of the few things that governments do that I happen to at least enjoy and feel I'm getting some of my money's worth. So for me, as a big private property guy, I'm okay with the fact that these people didn't get to use this land. Maybe it would have been better. It's hard to know if it's really not damaging anything. But I don't have any romance about oystering on Drake's Bay.
Sure.
So to me, this is just a I can't get outraged about it now, but partly it's because I read about it from you. So I'm wondering if I'd read about it. I read some other stories about it preparing for the interview, but I'm wondering, could someone have constructed a narrative that had a different emotional appeal? It's just an interesting question. It's not I don't know if there's an answer.
I think in general, for a lot of the other narratives, because the park employees were not permitted until it was over to talk about their involvement at all. the personal element, I think, was missing. So, one of the main characters in the book is Sarah Allen, the scientist whose work got called into question. And so I think that, I made attempts to talk to everyone involved individually. And so I think that I think maybe one of the reasons why you get that impression from the book is there's a little bit more of a humanizing aspect to a side of it that you didn't see as much of. But I don't know. I mean, I think also I had to get some perspective on it. And when you're in the middle of it and you're hanging out with people who are so stressed out about losing their business and they're crying and their children are crying, I mean, you just get so wrapped up in it emotionally. And it's hard not to, because this was such a big deal. And I think for a lot of people in the area, it was, there was something symbolic about it too. I mean, they care about their neighbors and they care about the community, but I think there was this other sort of, I don't know, like a subconscious anxiety about encroachment from outsiders, and that the local people who used the land were being replaced by tourists who just wanted it for recreation. And so I think there was something, because that was happening to a lot of people. People were being priced out of places that they'd grown up. A lot of rentals where normally, a young family might live, it was being put on Airbnb instead. And I've never actually heard anyone say this, but I feel like it's not an accident that this dispute became such a big deal at a time when the community was changing so drastically from the one that I grew up in, which was much, much mellower, more kind of hidden, to the demographics were changing, I guess.
Yeah,
anyway,
well, it's more upscale than it was, to be just simple about it.
Sure.
I think, right?
And people are getting priced out, and so there's just worry about that. Like I think I used the word gentrification in the book. It's not like an urban neighborhood in the same way, but there's this sense of, people are excited about the attention. Some people are having very successful businesses because of it, but it's a two-sided thing. So, no, I mean, I think there's many reasons to be very sympathetic to the Oyster Farm, but I think what did give me a bit of distance in the end was just trying to, lay out the arguments in its favor and investigate them as best I could. And in the end, it seemed to me that the correct decision was made, even though it was a difficult one and maybe heartbreaking one for many people. I wouldn't go that as someone with a different perspective. I wouldn't know whether there was the right decision. Right.
But I didn't think it was an unfair decision, which is, again, I think what really motivated so much of the dispute. I have no doubt that private owners of land are often better stewards of that land than bureaucrats, or if you want to make it a little more romantic, park rangers. I think there are people who take care of their land and let it revert to wilderness. And I should mention, there's a glorious prairie wilderness project going on in the Midwest that I'll put a link up to. That is, it's a private conservancy. It's not a government national park, and I'm a big fan of that. I just it's hard for me to get excited about oystering as a way of stewardship of the land, and it's just not there. It's just a question of it's for me. That's why, as a reader, it came down to fairness. I, like you, I assumed I was going to be sympathetic to the oyster company. By the time the book was over, I felt bad for them, like as you do.
Yeah.
But I don't think there was an injustice here. There may be and I don't think there's a particularly big policy error either while we're at it. But it's a small issue, and I think it's lovely that there's still some dairy farms there, and there are still some, right?
Oh yes, I mean there's a few have closed over the years, but there definitely are still many of the dairy farms still functioning with the same families that owned them 100 years ago. And one of the positive things to come out of this is the Department of the Interior has expressed a stronger commitment to maintaining those long term, because they also function on leases, and short leases at that. Some of them were on just 5-year leases that were renewing. But they're not in wilderness areas, so it's a different issue. And so I think some of them are getting 20-year leases now. And actually, the latest I heard is that Drake's Bay Oyster Company is opening a new oyster farm somewhere else.
Right. There's lots of land nearby that's not in the wilderness part of the area. There are oyster companies around the corner.
Exactly. There's oyster companies. There's another bay, a 15-minute drive away, and there's I think at least three or four oyster companies in that bay. I don't know if there's space for them. I was talking on Twitter with someone who's volunteered communications work for them over the years, and she was saying that she couldn't tell me exactly where yet because it wasn't 100% nailed down. But they've ordered a bunch of supplies from China for some new techniques, so they've got stuff in the works, and and that actually just found out about the last couple of weeks, so that didn't make it into the book. But so it seems that there will be a Drake's Bay Oyster Company, just not in Drake's Estero.
Let's close with your personal experience. You talk about, you've talked about here the challenges of listening to people cry about what's going on in their lives, and I'm sure it was a incredible experience to write this book and do the interviews and do the research. And if all goes as planned, this interview is coming out the day before your book is to be published. And you're going to get a set of reactions all over again. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that? I assume some people are going to love your book and others not so much. And what does that mean for you as someone who wants to go back there, I'm sure, and and enjoy that area?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm from there. But family members still live there. As I say in the book, my stepdad is one of the librarians in Point Reyes. So I've got roots in family, and I'll be back. And I think the thing to remember is that there are people that in the community that are very vocal about this and care a lot. And there's people that don't care so much at all. And people that somehow magically it's like not even really heard of it or seen these signs around about it and don't really know what it is and don't really care. So you talk about the community, and there's they're small, but there's a lot of people in the community who have other things going on. So I'm not worried about the community per se. I mean, with the story, I did my best to tell the truest version of the story that I could, and I wanted it to be a compassionate take on it. That was important to me, and somebody was worried about it being a hit piece, and I hope it doesn't come across that way, because that wasn't my intention with anybody. But I don't know. Yeah, the people aren't going to like it. I mean, and there's people I interviewed for the book who cooperated and agreed to be interviewed and answered all my questions, but still just didn't really like that the book was happening, but understood that they had become a part of a story that had national significance and national interest, and has been written about in the New York Times and Harper's, and been on CNN and Al Jazeera and Fox News, and so it's not a private story anymore. And so I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that, because part of me feels strange about telling these stories, but I was careful not to betray, I think, anyone's privacy with things that wasn't already out in the public sphere, or that they consented to have. So I tried to do this whole thing honorably, and people aren't going to like it because it's not the version of the story that they would tell personally. But I'd encourage them to tell their version of the story if that's what they want to do.
My guest today has been Summer Brennan. Her book is The Oyster War. Summer, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks so much, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.